one thing that everyone knows about Jonah is the whole big fish incident. How he got swallowed up by a big fish, or I don't know, maybe it was a whale, because it's not as if the ancient people of Israel knew the difference between fish and marine mammals. But anyways, he survived and came out 3 days later. Many people think that that is the most unbelievable part of the story, but they're wrong. There was something that was much more fantastic to the ancient Israelite readers of this whale of a tale than just the part about the fish. But to understand that, you need to understand a bit more about Jonah's story. Jonah stood just outside of the massive gates of Nineveh, and he looked out over what seemed to him to be an endless sea of houses and industries, streets full of crowds of people and beasts of burden. There were more people here than Jonah had ever seen together in his entire life before. His nose was being assailed by the odors of tanneries and latrines and manure and burning pitch. But honestly, the smell wasn't what bothered him most about what he was seeing. In truth, it was a bit of a relief to smell something that wasn't the stench of rotting fish, which he had been unable to get out of his clothes and skin and hair. But he didn't hate these people because of their smell. He hated them because they were Assyrians. They were not people. They were bloodthirsty animals, all of them. He could just tell by looking at them that they loved nothing more than raping and pillaging and looting and killing. And what's more, he knew in his heart that these were a people who would never change. They would continue to spread like a cancer over the face of the earth. They had destroyed the kingdom of Israel, taken its people away into exile. They had come this close to doing the same to the kingdom of Judah. And that's just 2 examples. How many other tribes and nations and people had suffered at the hand of the genocidal Assyrians? And yet Yahweh, the God of Israel, had sent Jonah to preach to them. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, God had said, and cry out against it, for their wickedness had come up before me. Now, it was all the same to Jonah if God wanted to destroy the Assyrians. He'd been praying for that for years. But he was a bit worried about the reason for why God would want him to warn the Assyrians. Because he knew his God, he knew Yahweh, that he was a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, ready to relent from punishing. It was disgusting. The very thought that God might squander such grace and mercy on the bloody Assyrians, why, it made him feel sick, and he wanted nothing to do with it. And so Jonah had gone in exactly the opposite direction. He had found a ship heading towards Tarshish and gotten on board. As he watched the shores of the promised land recede behind the stern of the ship, he was sure that he was free, that he had escaped from the presence of Yahweh. He had been so very wrong. And he knew that what happened next would probably haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. When he closed his eyes, he could still feel the movement of the unceasing waves in the storm. And the beast that had swallowed him, why, the sight of it would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life, much like the stench of it, he suspected, would never leave him. And when, by some miracle he would never understand, Jonah had survived and saw the light of day again, he knew that active disobedience was no longer an option for him. he would have to find some other way to make his feelings clear. Oh, he would go, and he would do as he had been ordered. But God hadn't said much about how the job was to be done. And so here Jonah stood, outside of the gates of the great city. The message he had been given was clear and succinct. And as a prophet who had often preached the word of the Lord to the people of Israel, Jonah knew how to speak persuasively and convincingly. But that was exactly what he was determined to forget. So Jonah took a deep breath, straightened his tunic, and took one step into the steady stream of foot traffic that was passing through the gate. And almost immediately, he stumbled into a burly trader. "Hey, watch out, buddy, I'm trying to walk here." Jonah sprang back, embarrassed and confused. He felt so disoriented in the midst of such a mob of people. He mumbled some words of apology, which of course only seemed to offend the trader all the more. "Speak up, you Israelite hick," he laughed. "Don't you know how to speak to your betters?" And that's what got Jonah really mad. And let me tell you something. There is nothing like an angry Jewish prophet. "Oh yeah," he said, "oh yeah, well, you know what? 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." The man laughed. But all of a sudden, Jonah realized that he had his message. He realized with a prophet's certainty that the words that Yahweh had sent him to deliver were those very words. Now, there had been nothing in the contract that specified how those words were to be delivered. And so this is what Jonah did. He continued to walk through the bustling city. And as that day went on, he had various encounters with the locals, and he just sort of casually slipped the line into his conversation. He purchased some street food at a small counter. It was nasty Assyrian stuff, disgusting to his Israelite palate. But he was hungry, so it would have to do. He haggled for a price, and he was sure that the savvy vendor was cheating him. And so, as he walked away, he just sort of casually said over his shoulders, "Hey, oh, by the way, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." By the end of the afternoon, he had delivered that message to about 20 people. He was tired and parched. And so he found a small alehouse on a corner of two streets. He went inside to discover that it was filled with locals who were just taking a break. Well, Jonah figured that he had been working hard too. He deserved a break. So he pulled up a stool and he joined them. About an hour and several rounds later, Jonah found himself feeling as if he were surrounded with some new friends. Now, Jonah intended to be outside of the gates before nightfall. So he swallowed the last dregs out of his ale pot and bid them all adieu. "My friends, it's been so nice to meet you," he said. "I'm almost sad to know that." And with that, the entire room joined in the chorus. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." The laughter echoed as Jonah went out back into the streets. And that was it. I mean, the city of Nineveh was huge. It took 3 days to cross it. 3. And yet Jonah had barely made it into the business district. He'd come nowhere near to the royal palace or the heart of the government. And he didn't care. The orders he had been given had been carried out to the letter, and only to the letter. He'd gone into the city, he had spoken the warning of the Lord. And now Jonah was determined only to do one thing. He would wait to see it all happen. He would watch Nineveh burn, and he would enjoy it. Meanwhile, inside the gates of the great city, something was happening. Something that Jonah would never believe. Somehow, all of the people who had met Jonah on that strange day remembered what he had said. And they told their friends. And their friends told other friends. And before long, the words that Jonah had said so casually, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown, seemed to take on a menacing tone, especially as they were overheard as they passed around the streets and the marketplaces, coming from everywhere. A few people became alarmed. Maybe there was something to this crazy warning. Word began to spread, even to the upper classes, and before long, word was even brought to the palace of the great king. By this point, the words of Jonah had become mixed up with various rumors that always seemed to swirl in the city of the attack of this or that enemy. People had begun to openly speculate about whether the Assyrian Empire might have finally gone too far in inflicting pain and suffering upon the nations of the world. And so, by the time it came into the king's court, the king felt as if he had no choice but to do something to stave off the panic that was beginning to form. He could not afford another time of unrest. And so, amazingly, the king put on sackcloth, and he sat in ashes, and he made a show of repenting of many of the policies of his empire. A fast was proclaimed throughout the city, and people began to talk of a new beginning for the people of Assyria. But Jonah knew nothing of all this. His message proclaimed, his assignment accomplished, he could have just left and returned to his own country. But Jonah was not about to do that. Did I mention how much he hated the Assyrians? So Jonah had vowed to himself that he was not going anywhere until he had seen the complete and utter destruction that he had foretold. So he found himself a nice spot on a hill overlooking the great city. He built himself a little shelter, and he settled in to wait and see what would come to pass. Now, 40 days is a very long time to wait. But Jonah didn't care. For the sight of Nineveh in flames would be recompense enough for all that he had put up with through this entire miserable affair. Oh, yes, Jonah would wait. But then, after 40 days had come and gone, the city was still standing. And Jonah kind of lost it. "Oh, Yahweh," he cried out, "is not this what I said while I was still in my own country? This is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. For I knew that you are a gracious God, and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and ready, oh, so ready to relent from punishing. And now, O Yahweh, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." And he sat and he sulked. And while he sat there feeling miserable, a castor bean plant grew. and it sent its vines to climb up upon the shelter that Jonah had built. And when it spread out its broad leaves, it sheltered Jonah from the sun. And that made the day almost feel pleasant. But on the next day, the plant turned brown and shriveled up and died. And on that day, Jonah felt the heat of the sun all the more keenly. And that's when Jonah got really angry, and he cried out to God in his frustration, "If you are going to treat me like this, just kill me now." Jonah was that angry. But even as the anger burned, a question began to bother him. Why am I so angry? I'm angry about a plant that it didn't even exist a couple of days ago, and I'm angry that it's dead. It didn't make sense, but he did care. He cared about that plant because it had made one day of his life that less miserable. And he began to wonder if he could care so much about a silly little bean plant, enough to want to die because it was dead. Was it so ridiculous that the God of Israel might care about the people of a city, especially the common folks and even the animals who had nothing to do with the policies of the Assyrian king and his armies? Was it so ridiculous that God might be willing to spare their lives? It seems clear that the ancient people of Israel, for whom the book of Jonah was written, understood that the story was a fantasy. What would have convinced them of that? Not the part about the big fish, not really. No, there was something far more ridiculous than that in the book. The most unbelievable part of the story was the mere idea that the Assyrians might have repented from their evil. The Assyrians were universally despised, hated, and feared, and they never showed any sign of regret for all that they had done. They never repented, and in the end, they suffered destruction at the hand of the Babylonians in their turn. Anyone who first read this story knew very well that it hadn't happened, that it couldn't have happened. So what was the point of telling the story? I suspect the author was asking his readers to ask themselves a very difficult question. How great is the grace and mercy of our God? And is it so great that it might even extend to people as evil as the Assyrians if they should repent? And Jonah, with all his passive-aggressive anger, is the representative of the readers of this story, who are completely scandalized by the very idea of God's grace and mercy applying to such terrible people. This book was meant to make you think long and hard about the hatred that you hold for the people who have hurt you or have hurt the people that you love. It is meant to teach you how the grudges we hold eat away at us, keep us from being our best selves, how they trap us underneath a miserable shelter as our lives are put on hold, waiting for the kind of punishment of our enemies that brings no good purpose and only takes a bit of pleasant shade out of the world. This story is there to make us think again about the hatreds we hold so close to our hearts and how very useless they are. Let's pray. Lord our God, we, like everyone, as we've gone through our lives, have had people hurt us, disappoint us, let us down, or have done terrible, unspeakable even things to people that we have loved. And sometimes, Lord, like Jonah, we like to hold on to that hatred. And we hold it inside us, and it eats away at us. Lord, justice and judgment must be in your hands. But let us not bear the weight of hatred, and let it not let us be destroyed from within. Set us free. Amen.